Dumelang, welcome to Face the Nation. My name is Clement Manyatela. It's great to have you with us here on SABC News. On the show tonight, offensive, condescending and inconsistent with the Constitution. That's how the ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa has described the letter the DA sent to him stating their preferred cabinet posts. In a leaked letter, the President bemoans the DA's attitude during the negotiations and accuses the party of wanting to set up a parallel government that would operate outside the framework and parameters of the Constitution. He even describes as legally incompetent and misguided some of the proposals by the DA. The ball is now in the DA's court. So will they take the deal or walk away, seeing that the President won't accede to their request for 8 cabinet positions? We'll get some analysis from Dr. Kathy Powell and Professor Dirk Kotze. Also on the show, are our soldiers in the DRC sufficiently capacitated to undertake the mission in that country? 2 more of our soldiers, in fact 2 died earlier. There are more soldiers that have died now during a military operation. The SANDF will speak to us tonight. But first, the comment. So, is the deal on or off? That's the question tonight, as the DA just completed its FedEx meeting this evening to decide and just get an update on where things are with the negotiations around the constitution of government. What's clear, though, is that the tensions between the ANC and the DA have deepened, and that's clearly expressed in the letter that ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa wrote to John Steenhuisen, who is the leader of the Democratic Alliance. Now, the leaders of the 2 parties met a few days ago where the ANC made an offer of 6 cabinet posts to the DA, which included the trade and industry portfolio, which, by the way, is quite a key portfolio in the economic cluster. But then it appears the ANC withdrew the trade and industry ministry from that offer, which then upset the Democratic Alliance. John Steenhuisen then wrote a letter to President Cyril Ramaphosa demanding 2 additional posts to move that number from 6 cabinet posts to 8. And the DA said they believe this would reflect the will of the people as expressed in the electoral outcome. But this clearly angered the President and the ANC negotiators, because in a letter that has now been leaked from President Cyril Ramaphosa to John Steenhuisen, Ramaphosa told Steenhuisen that the ANC found the letter from the DA's Helen Zille as offensive, as condescending, as inconsistent with the Constitution. And it was clear from our conversation with ANC NEC member Ronald Lamola on Tuesday on this show that the ANC was not pleased with the Democratic Alliance.
No self-respecting party can accede to such demands. And that's why I said, even when you look into the statement of intent, it's very clear. The President will consult with them in the exercise of his prerogative.
That's what the ANC NEC member Ronald Lamola told us on the show. The President also says in this letter that's been leaked that the habit of negotiating through correspondence as adopted by the DA can be problematic. It can, for example, make parties play to the gallery of public opinion through media leakages, resulting in the loss of focus on the real substance of the negotiations. Lamola also touched on this when he was on this show on Tuesday, even suggesting that the letter that Helen Zille wrote to the ANC reached the newspapers first, before it could even reach the African National Congress.
The letter, we only found it after we've seen the Sunday Times of those demands, and it
the
came
letter
later
got to you
and so forth.
So the Sunday Times reported on the letter before it reached you.
Yeah.
All right, so what Ronald Lamola says after that comment is that the ANC actually saw the letter from the Democratic Alliance after it was reported about in the Sunday newspapers. So Ramaphosa further says in this letter that's been leaked that the ANC discussions with the DA, the PA, the IFP, the Good Party, the PAC, UDM, Al-Jamaa, even the Freedom Front Plus and Rise Mzansi, they've all been geared towards those conversations. They were geared towards building and consolidating the government of national unity in the national interest. And he goes on to say that the discussions with all the 10 parties to that statement of intent have served to entrench an appreciation for the Constitution and its values, as well as understanding of the rules and protocols that facilitate effective and lawful government. And unfortunately, the President says, this has not been the case with the Democratic Alliance. The President also in the letter accuses the DA of wanting to set up a parallel government that would operate outside the framework and parameters of the Constitution. He even describes as legally incompetent and misguided the proposal by the DA to redetermine contracts, in fact, with the DGs. So he wraps up that letter by reminding the DA that the prerogative to appoint cabinet sits with him. So he says he has been taken aback by how the DA now wants 2 more portfolios to bring the DA's portfolios to 8. And the DA seems to be insisting on the 8 portfolios. But in this letter, the President says he can't accede to this proposal by the Democratic Alliance. So is this the straw that breaks the camel's back? The ANC is clearly fuming. They are essentially saying, we made you a deal, take it or leave it. The DA is essentially saying, no. We have made too many compromises. So what happens now? The President in this letter says the task of setting up government is quite urgent and this paralysis can't continue. He told the DA he intends to conclude all negotiations and consultations this week. And there are people in the DA trying to persuade Steenhuisen to take the deal, but there are others on the negotiating team who think that clearly the DA can squeeze out more positions from the ANC. But if the DA walks away, does it work for them? It's not going to look good for them. How different would that make them from the Patriotic Alliance, for instance, which they used to accuse of just being about positions in the Johannesburg Metro? Remember, Helen Zille was always ready to take the Patriotic Alliance on, because whenever they were not happy, they all say, we walk away. And the DA always accused them of being opportunistic. And also, it would be a tactical move. It would be a bad or a good tactical move for the DA to miss out on the opportunity to put one foot in the government. So the question tonight is, should the DA just walk away? Should the DA reconsider its response to the African National Congress on the new proposals, or would they be compromising themselves further? You can send us your WhatsApps responding to the latest on the GNU. The voice note line is 078-459-1897. Remember to tell us your name and surname and where you're sending the voice note from, and please keep it at 30 seconds. Alternatively, you can send us an X on @FaceTheNation SABC. We'll look at your WhatsApp voice notes and analyze the current dynamics after the break. Stay with us. Welcome back. ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa has written this harsh letter to the DA leader John Steenhuisen, accusing him of changing the terms of the talks about who will hold cabinet roles. In the letter, Ramaphosa told Steenhuisen that they found the earlier letter by the DA Federal Chairperson Helen Zille to ANC Secretary-General Fikile Mbalula offensive, condescending and inconsistent with the Constitution. Ramaphosa in his letter further says the DA has been disruptive and uncooperative in the negotiations, unlike other parties. Let's unpack this now, because the Democratic Alliance has just had a federal executive meeting today, and they indicated that they will not be taking interviews until they take their final decision. Let's bring in now Dr. Kathy Powell, who is an associate professor in public law at the University of Cape Town, and Professor Dirk Kotze, who's the professor of political science at UNISA. Thank you so much to both of you for making time for us. I'll start with you, Dr. Kathy Powell. When you look at this letter that the president has written to John Steenhuisen, what does it communicate? He's clearly an unhappy man.
I think it communicates a great deal of irritation, some of which is well-deserved. I think that what it shows is that the government of national unity has to actually start functioning as a government rather than a lot of squalling political parties. So the statement of intent came out that suggested a joint way forward with particular mechanisms to solve disputes and grievances that came up and to establish common points. And I think one of the most important points that President Ramaphosa makes in his letter is that this did not involve airing disputes through the media. So this thing of having public letters and making demands and making claims and trying to get public opinion on your side in what is meant to be a government of national unity, that's a problem. I think the point was well made by the president, and I hope very much the DA does listen to it, because otherwise we're not going to get a government up and running.
Yeah. Professor Kotze, you know, there are people even in the Democratic Alliance who said, oh, you guys are over-exaggerating the disagreements that we have with the African National Congress. It does take long to set up a government of national unity, and of course there are going to be teething problems. There will be back and forth, and part of the negotiating tactics may include leaking stuff, you know, because parties want to somehow test the waters or, you know, somehow influence the public narrative. Is it really exaggerated, or are there really fundamental differences here that we're seeing from the letters that have been leaked so far?
No, I don't think there are fundamental differences. This is typical negotiations. It's typical tactics that's being used, especially late in a negotiation process. We all know from the information that we've now received from the different participants that they are at a very advanced stage. And that it is now about some of the final points that must be concluded. We've seen it in the way in which the ANC gave some feedback of the process. The same with the DA. Quite a number of their negotiators have said that. And I think that the common message from both sides is that there's no question about walking away from the negotiations, no question about the stalemate. I know the media maybe sometimes interpret it a bit in a more different way, because it's exciting. It's exciting news at the moment. It makes a lot of news. But from my point of view, I think there's a process that's the real negotiation process is taking place, and then there's components that reach the public. And that is also part of the negotiation process, because this is an uneven situation. The ANC is twice the size of the DA, and the DA is 4 times the size of the IFP, and 20 times the size of the PAC, and 10 times the size of the Patriotic Alliance. So it's not an even playing field for these different political parties, and how to adjust to that is quite difficult. But I'm quite sure by late this week, maybe early Monday, because Sunday is the deadline, they will come to a conclusion. And once they've done that, I think then the gelling is going to take place between the different parties. It's a very demanding process, and it is because it's so complex, because there's 10 participants in this process.
Dr. Kathy Powell, let's look at some of what the president raises. You said earlier that, you know, some of the harshness that comes from the president was deserved, and perhaps this is a part where, because there are even some that admit that there are certain aspects of that letter the DA sent to Fikile Mbalula that were quite problematic. When you look at what they say about DGs, for instance, or what they say about the contracts with the DGs, and even looking at the tenders. And the letter the president wrote, there's a part where the president says, I also prefer not to deal further with the legally incompetent proposal to unilaterally redetermine contractual arrangements of director generals and other contracts. Did the DA get it wrong by including this aspect in that original letter? Because I struggle to see how they're going to be justifying that.
Yes, it's particularly difficult for a party that has been complaining about cadre deployment for all this time. They, I suppose, would claim that they're fixing cadre deployment by reviewing all these contracts, but they are claiming the right to do so with a panel of DA members, which is not the meritocracy that one would imagine they should be building up now. If you're going to have a panel selecting the directors general or the people high up in the public service, you would want the full panel. You'd want the Government of National Unity to be doing the choosing. You wouldn't want one party to be doing it. So I don't know what the current labor conditions of employment are for directors general, but I doubt very much that they're all up for grabs the moment there's been a general election. So what the DA seems to have done is to have claimed the right to interfere with existing contracts. If I'm wrong on that, then no, I stand under correction because, as I said, I don't know what the terms are. But unlike cabinet ministers, directors general do in fact have the protection of labor law. So if they're going to be fired, it needs to be for a reason.
Yes.
So that was a legally incompetent idea. And what was also what smacked of not only arrogance but inconsistency with their previous position is that the DA claimed that it is a panel of DA members who could make the decision on the next Director General. I mean, that is quite ludicrous, both in general employment terms, in terms of a government of national unity, and in terms of their own position on cadre deployment.
Yeah, Professor Kotze, when you look at even part of the letter, the President reminds John Steenhuisen, says, remember that in the Constitution, the prerogative rests with me to appoint cabinet. So how in a government of national unity where you have to balance the interests of the different political parties that are in this GNU with you, how do you balance that with also just observing the values of the Constitution and the kind of right and prerogative the Constitution gives you to appoint your cabinet? Because in this case, the DA says this is what we want. In one way, you could think they've got every right to do that because you've invited them to be part of government. They're not here to prop you up. They also want some key critical portfolios. But on the other hand, the ANC may interpret that as, why are you trying to subvert the Constitution? It's the President who must decide how to constitute his executive.
Yes, I think this is an exceptionally fine balance that they have to strike. Because on the one hand, you are absolutely correct. The Constitution says that the President must appoint the members of the Cabinet and the Deputy Ministers, as well as the Deputy President. But our Constitution was largely designed for one majority party government. It is not really designed for coalition governments. And in other countries which are primarily coalition government systems, like the Netherlands, for example, there they have structured processes which are not dictated necessarily by a party leader, but there are facilitators that are involved in this process. So I think what the balance that must be struck is, yes, President Ramaphosa is the president, but the ANC is not anymore, does not have an absolute majority anymore. So he can't on his own, within his party, appoint a cabinet. And that's where the consultation and the negotiations come in. So although it is not necessarily part of the constitutional design, it is something which is now unavoidable, that there will be negotiations between different parties in order to establish the government. The President Ramaphosa will be the one that will ultimately take the final decisions. Especially in the case of the smaller parties, we could see that the process is not of negotiations between the ANC and them, but rather a consultation process. It is, to a large extent, only the ANC and the DA that's involved in some form of a negotiation process. I don't see even that the IFP, which is the third biggest party, or that they are very much involved in the negotiation process. So this is something relatively unique between the ANC and the DA. But it is because they are the two biggest parties. They constitute 62% of the total number of seats in Parliament. So they, to a large extent, will dictate also later on, within the so-called sufficient consensus arrangement, the dynamics within the Government of National Unity.
Yeah, and speaking of the other smaller parties, Dr. Powell, part of the disagreement here, because the DA argues that even in Gauteng, for instance, they're saying apportion us and give us posts proportionate to our support. Don't just decide, oh, we'll give you 3 or give you 4. No, look at the support we have, the seats we have in the National Assembly, and it's based on that formula that you must then say, these are the posts that we are going to give to you. And yes, in that statement of intent, it's not clearly, there's no formula that's clearly stated, but it does say that whatever decision you make must express the will of the people. The ANC argument, Dr. Powell, has been that, well, we can't give you these 8 posts because we've got to satisfy and also, bring in other smaller parties as well that are part of the government of national unity. Is that reason sufficient by the ANC, where they say, well, we've got other members here, we also need to give them positions of sorts? And the DA says, well, in that case, we shouldn't be the only ones that lose the positions. Then as the ANC, take from what you are entitled to and give to the smaller parties, because you are the ones that invited them.
Yes, that argument works. At the same time, we must be aware that this clause in the Statement of Intent, Clause 16, does speak about broad correlation between the strength of the parties and the positions in cabinet and the legislature. Remember, there can't be an exact correlation, because then the smallest parties will have no representation whatsoever, because they would be too small to create one human being amidst the pool of people that have to get of posts that have to be filled. The way you put it, I must say, is quite convincing. I myself was finding this sort of public demand for, right, we want X number of cabinet posts and so many deputy ministers, and we want them in these areas, and remember that we're not taking part in provincial governments unless you do this. And I was finding that arrogant and patronizing. It's interesting to see a different perspective on the whole process come from Professor Kotze, so this is educational for me. But the point is that this is not the place, I would say. And again, I'm not speaking now as a lawyer because the Constitution doesn't cover this. But this is not the point, I would say, where people start to get particularly hostile in the public. In fact, I'd be interested to hear from Professor Kotze. He's saying we're nearly at the end. But surely at the end, we should start to get the feeling that these guys are pulling together and not apart. So it worries me that we're in a situation that's starting to threaten the rand just at the very point where we're starting to hope we have a government.
And Professor Kotze, politically speaking, would it look good on the DA if they decide to walk away? Because at this stage, it appears the ball is in their court. The president in this letter says, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to accede to your request to move the number from 6 to 8. The DA has to decide whether it takes that deal or not. Would it look good for them? And by the way, I asked that because the Democratic Alliance, Helen Zille particularly, even other leaders of the DA, have consistently criticized the Patriotic Alliance and said, you are all about positions. That's why we don't want to work with you sometimes, because when we don't give you what you want, you walk away and you go join the other team. But they would be walking away now because they didn't get what they want.
Yeah, the chances for walking away by the DA is very close to zero. Given the dynamics that we've seen now, given the fact that the DA has gained so much in terms of the negotiation process already. I mean, the 6 seats in the cabinet is quite a significant number for them. And I think this is, in a sense, a fair position of what they can expect. So the 8 is about bargaining. It is about brinkmanship. And I use this concept regularly now, that we are in the phase of brinkmanship in terms of negotiations. So it is, who's the first one who's going to blink? Who's the first one who's going to say, okay, I accept this deal just for the sake of having to conclude this? Because the one thing which the DA will be using is KwaZulu-Natal. Because if the DA walks away from this deal, the KwaZulu-Natal government will collapse. and it will mean that the government will go to the MK party. And that will mean that one of the main objectives of the ANC of these negotiations, and that is to keep the MK out of KwaZulu-Natal, will fail. So I think that's a very powerful bargaining chip that the DA will have in this situation. But they cannot overplay it. So I think they understand it. They are very, on both sides. The ANC has a very good negotiating team. The DA has also an experienced negotiating team. They understand these dynamics. I'm absolutely sure about that. So for them, they will come to the point. I'm not expecting that the ANC is going to make any concessions anymore. And it is then the DA will then ultimately accept it, and that will be the deal. But walking away at this point in time when they've made so much progress is not on the cards at the moment.
Yeah. Dr. Powell, let's say the DA does get these 6 posts and they say, okay, fine, we'll take whatever you give us. I mean, how much... Because as a party that's coming into the government of national unity, they also want to effect meaningful change. The next elections are coming up in 5 years' time. They want to be able to say to South Africans, look at what we were able to do when we were given the opportunity to govern in the government of national unity. So the question then is, will they be able to make that meaningful change? Because when I spoke to Ronald Lamola on the show this week, he said, well, there's existing policy. It's not like the DA is coming to implement their own policy. Also, the power rests in cabinet. Yes, you can be a minister of trade and industry or a minister of home affairs. At the end of the day, it's not like you've got carte blanche to do whatever you want. Decisions are still taken at cabinet. So they're still somehow going to be, sort of put between a rock and a hard place in that cabinet still, whether you're a DA or ANC minister, cabinet needs to be the one that takes the decisions.
Well, yes and no. I think the amount of change that the DA can bring will depend on which cabinet posts they get. It is true that cabinet as a whole makes decisions on major matters, and those decisions, I presume, are made by at least majority. So far, probably made by consensus, but now that we have a government of national unity, we'd have to work on majority, a sufficient consensus, as the statement of intent says. On the other hand, within each ministry, there is a lot of work that just carries on happening. And we have all seen how much difference or damage particular cabinet ministers can do in their particular jobs. I mean, think of the firing of Pravin Gordhan and the bringing in of Des Van Rooyen. Think of what happened to what's happened to minerals and land and other major areas of South African development, depending on who was in charge. So I think the individual cabinet minister does make a huge difference. If the DA ends up getting 6 cabinet positions that are fairly inconsequential in terms of the big questions, I think they are going to be frustrated in their attempts to somehow move South Africa in a direction that they would like.
Yeah. Professor Kotze, your thoughts on that? I think Dr. Powell makes a good point there about the power that still rests with individual ministers. I'm reminded now of the nuclear deal, for instance, and how the minister at the time, the late minister, was signing off on particular contracts, even though there was no consensus that is the way to go. Because at the time, the understanding even from Treasury was that we don't really have the money to go with these projects now. How do you see it?
Yes, to some extent I agree with this. I think one has to make a distinction between policy and then implementation. Policies are going to be collectively determined. It's a myth to think that if you are a patriotic-aligned minister, you implement the PA's policy in that particular ministry. It won't work like that. Or if you are a DA minister in, for example, let's say public administration, then you will implement the DA's policy there. It is going to be the government's policy, the collective policy. The Constitution, as well as the documents that they've already, like the statement of intent and some that they will develop, is about collective accountability. It's about collective responsibility for policy making. And I'm also expecting that we are going to see a situation where the minister is from one party and the deputy minister from another party. So it's not that there will be some ministries and departments that will be in the hands of a particular party then. So what can make a huge difference is the effectiveness of the minister. To what extent the minister can get that department on a sound basis, that it performs well, that it implements the policies, that it responds to the public in general. Governance is at a high level. I just very recently saw an interview with Helen Zille in which she said, it took 15 years for the DA really to bring the Western Cape to the point where they are now. She was cautioning that there must be not too high expectations of what the DA can do, even if they are in a strong position in a government of national unity.
In fact, the statement of intent says, this is clause 13, it says, the parties to the GNU shall have a period of 6 weeks from the formation of the GNU to develop an agreed policy agenda which shall include policy priorities and policy compromises. I suspect, Dr. Powell, that's going to be the next hurdle, because you need parties that must bring all their manifestos, and because now you need an agreed policy. Yes, there's existing policy in place, but now this is a different constitution of government, and this document is very clear in that there must also be policy compromises, which is then going to be interesting to see where the DA or even the ANC and what they compromise on.
Yes, you're right, it's the next hurdle. It's going to be a major hurdle in areas such as international relations. There are going to be huge gaps to bridge. And if I may go back to the issue of conducting this all in public rather than deciding it as a cabinet, I think this is going to be an area where it's particularly important not to try to soapbox, because given cabinet responsibility, we are meant to hear the position of cabinet once it is found, not the position of all the people who are fighting in cabinet to get their view to win. I am just conscious, and again, I'm speaking out of my area now because I'm speaking of the political effect of this particular mode of communication. But I'm conscious of the turmoil that these kinds of negotiation bring. Yes, they're exciting, as Professor Kotze was saying, but what they do is they introduce a sense of uncertainty, and they affect South Africa's economy and South Africa's standing in the international sphere. So yes, there's going to be a lot of negotiating happening, and I hope they can do it behind closed doors in a really, really grown-up way, and we just get the final position. And that all cabinet ministers are then prepared to defend that final position. That really is a challenge, because they won't all agree with it.
Yeah. Professor Kotze, do you think that's going to be quite a tricky process when all these different parties, which, yes, fundamentally, the DA particularly and the ANC, when you look at their economic policies, they're not really that far apart, but there are some nitty-gritties where they disagree on, whether it's on transformation and how to bring about transformation, affirmative action, etc. Do you think that's going to be quite a tricky process?
Well, potentially, yes. But I think the approach, we can think back to 1994. One of the first tasks of the Government of National Unity then was to use the ANC's policy document, the RDP document, and the three parties together, the ANC, the NNP, and the IFP, wrote a white paper on the RDP that was the basis document of the Government of National Unity then. Now they are talking about the Lekgotla and the national dialogue, which will possibly be broader than simply these parties of the Government of National Unity. So it looks to me there's going to be a lot of dialogue and debate about policy matters. And when it comes to any coalition government, they concentrate on what's the common denominators. What do they share in the first instance? We've seen already in the statement of intent that there's quite a number of aspects about fundamental values or basic values, as well as some aspects about policy already that they've included there as sort of the basis of these negotiations and the beginning of the Government of National Unity. I think the negotiations, I'm not sure if we can call it negotiations. It will be more about policy development, I would say. And it will not be under the same pressure as what we are seeing at the moment, because there won't be a timeline to it about when it must be completely finalized. The effect of that is, for the moment, to a large extent, the ANC's policies will continue to be implemented. It's only over time that there will become some maybe nuanced changes or different approaches or some aspects of policies that will be less emphasized than by the whole government than up to now what the ANC did. So it's going to be a complex situation, but as I've said in the beginning, when it comes to decision making, it's going to be ultimately a decision between the ANC and the DA, because sufficient consensus is clearly stated as a minimum of 60%, and they have more than that in the government. And so the final decision-making will be, in a sense, done by them.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating. Professor Dirk Kotze, Dr. Kathy Powell, I appreciate both of you this evening on Face the Nation. Thank you so much for your insights. We'll be taking your tweets on the question we've been asking you tonight about whether you think the DA should walk away. The ball is now in their court. We'll take some of your WhatsApp voice notes and tweets after the break. Stay with us. Welcome back. Now, President Cyril Ramaphosa has expressed his sadness following the death of 2 SANDF soldiers and 20 others who sustained injuries in a mortar attack on their base in Sake in eastern DRC. In February this year, 2 South African soldiers were also killed and 3 of their colleagues were injured in the DRC after a mortar bomb landed inside their military base. The soldiers have been deployed in the country since December to fight armed rebel group, the M23. This is a conflict in the DRC that is long-standing, really, hostility. SANDF spokesperson Spiwe Dlamini is joining us tonight. Mr. Dlamini, thank you so much for making time for us this evening. Let's just start with the status of the 4 soldiers that were critically injured in this attack. How are they doing now?
They've been stabilized, Clement, and let me first apologize by this technical glitch here. I'm not sure what's wrong with my laptop. However, and thanks for having me. The 4 soldiers that were critically injured have been stabilized, and they have been taken to Goma Hospital, which is the nearest major city from Sake. And I'm hoping that once they have reach their full stability, they'll be able to be flown back to South Africa, which is the norm.
Mm-hmm. How different, Mr. Dlamini, was this recent attack from the first one that saw 2 soldiers being killed as well?
It's different in the sense that both the South African members who are based in Sake were engaging the negative forces in this instance. And during the engagement, one of the negative forces, mortar, landed in our bases, which was not far from where the engagement was taking place. So basically what I'm saying is that there was a fight that ensued between our troops and the M23. And during that, one of their mortar landed in the base.
So let's talk about the necessary capacity and resources that our soldiers need to be part of this military operation. Have they been sent to this battlefield with adequate support?
Let me go back a bit, Clement. This is not a South African-only mission. It is a SADC mission, and SADC countries do and are contributing to this mission. So invariably, countries would contribute this, that, or the other, and so would South Africa do the same. There's presently 3 countries that are actually having their feet on the ground in the DRC, which is Tanzania, Malawi, and South Africa. Be that as it may, the other countries who are not there are also contributing whatever material that may be needed. So in my view, the support is there, albeit it might not be enough.
So what kind of support are we talking about here? Like, for instance, is there air support? Like, do they have counter-rocket, maybe mortar-based protection system? Because the DRC is quite mountainous as well. I mean, its road infrastructure is not so good, especially in the areas where the defense force is. So it's going to be vital then that there is sufficient and effective air support. Do our soldiers, as part of this mission, have that?
In our planning, Clement, and to the viewers, one of the critical things that we do before we undertake a mission of this nature, or any other mission for that matter, the planning is done such that we take into consideration all the resources that may be needed. And that's why I'm saying countries in the DRC, countries that are contributing to this mission would therefore pledge that they would pledge this equipment, that equipment. If they're pledging financial resources, they would pledge those. Now, as we deploy, we don't deploy lock, stock, and barrel. We deploy in phases, and those equipment that are needed at a point in time would be deployed as we upscale the deployment. So the efficiency of that deployment is determined on the scale of what is needed on the ground. And in this case, it would be sufficient to say that we are deploying as we fight.
Okay, but as we speak right now, do the soldiers have air support?
They would, because this is a responsibility that SADC itself took responsible for. As I say, we all are contributing, Clement.
So I'm asking that, Mr. Dlamini, because obviously we don't want to send our soldiers to a mission where we leave them vulnerable and only rely on, well, there are other countries as well that are going to be deploying their resources. I would imagine that as the South African government, you have some responsibility as well to ensure that as you send them out, there are sufficient resources for them to be able to effectively be part of this operation, which is why I'm asking about, let's talk about, for instance, the Roy Falk helicopters. Do they have them? Like when they arrive on the field, do you check as the SANDF that there's enough resources? Perhaps if you didn't have, for instance, the helicopters, then Tanzania or Malawi, you make sure that they've provided such, because that's going to be quite critical.
Clement, that's a very important question, and that's why I'll take it back to say, even before there is such a deployment where you have a foot on the ground or boots on the ground, the assessment of that planning determines what are the needs that are required for our troops to conduct their mission successfully and also in a safe manner. And if one country does not have this, that, or the other, obviously the next country may provide that. And that planning takes place in those circumstances where we say country X will provide this capability, country Y will provide that capability. That is part of the planning, Clement.
So are you able to confirm to us whether South Africa or Tanzania or Malawi have provided the necessary helicopters that are needed?
As far as I'm aware, that capacity would have come from the SADC in Botswana.
Okay, because also the other problem here is that there are field hospitals that are too far from where the base is. Is it not necessary to perhaps have a field hospital where this base is to avoid a situation where when there's an attack like this, where there are soldiers that are injured, it doesn't take the other soldiers long to take them to like the DRC hospitals?
Let me point this out to you, Clement. We have medical officials on the ground with the troops. We have ambulances, and we have all other medical equipment that you might need on the ground. So before these members, should they be injured, are transported to the third level hospital, which is in Goma, they are able to be stabilized on the scene in and around the base, because that capacity is there. The members would then be flown or driven to Goma, which is the next high-level hospital. In this case, those that are injured who are South Africans would then be brought home from the Goma hospital, but they would have been stabilized right there where the action is taking place.
Are you able to say if there's enough funding to sustain this mission? We know about the budget cuts that we have seen in the SANDF, and I mean it takes money and costs money to fight wars or to take on even groups like the M23 who often are dealing with sophisticated weaponry. Is there sufficient financial resources to sustain this mission?
Clement, military by its nature is a very expensive institution, and once you go to war, it's even worse. And during our planning, and it's known by yourselves and on colleagues and any other person that we have had commitment from our government, from as high authority as possible. If you recall, when the president was speaking, I think in his last parliamentary appearance, he made mention of the fact that it's now too long overdue that the defense force should be resourced in accordance to their needs and in accordance to what is required from government. So we are confident that the support of such resources has been decided upon and will be trickling in.
And in terms of the period to conclude this mission, when is that expected? When can we expect them home?
Look, Clement, the determination is normally done by the organization that deliberated on this mission for SADC to deploy. So I would assume that as and when the SADC nations in the region get briefed about the developments in such a mission, decisions will be made at that level.
All right. SANDF spokesperson Spiro Dlamini, thank you so much for making time for us on Face the Nation. Remember, we asked you the question about whether you think the DA must just walk away, right? Should the DA reconsider its response to the African National Congress on the new proposals, or would they be compromising themselves further? There are tweets that have come through. Kolile says, Clement, they need to close this chapter. This is too much now. It's more than a week now, and we don't know who leads different departments. This is politically wrong and unfair to us all citizens of South Africa. I seek order to all those in power. This is Kolile in Kukuletu. Misbelieve says it's the nature of political negotiations. They are not easy, but they will find each other. Father of three says the DA should take the offer given to them by the ANC. If not satisfied with what is offered, then they must leave the GNU rather than reducing it into coalition between them and the ANC. Tabello says circumstances have changed. New parties have joined the GNU, so the DA cannot continue saying they want the same number of positions they were initially promised when we now have more parties that have recently joined. The lesser said about the DGs, the better. It was a non-starter. Elvis says, I think they will finally sign and proceed to form a government. If the DA is still committed to saving us from bad apples, they will make compromises. Anyway, their differences are based on facts, not ideological. It's easy to sort out facts. All right, thank you so much for your tweets. This is where we wrap up the Thursday edition of Face the Nation. We'll be back with you on Tuesday next week. Have a good evening. Cheers.